There are effectively two forms of competition. One is selective competition, which is what currently exists, where you go into a store and there's 15 different brands of the same product. The second means is comparative competition, where you compare the services provided in one area or in one group with another. That second means is using essentially gaming theory. It is also a very effective way of improving quality and service. It has not been adopted, and the fact that it has not been adopted is why there is so much bad management and incompetent service provided. An example could be, for instance, military meals. A better way of running military meal service would be to have a contract for each military base. They would be given up to a maximum amount of money that they can spend for each soldier's daily meals. The personnel would, on a yearly basis, vote on the quality of service on a scale of 0 to 10. The amount of money that they spent on each meal would be divided by the rating. Whoever has the least expensive service would retain their contracts. The people with the more expensive services would then lose their contracts. So if you say it's $20 per meal and somebody spends $18 for the meal and gets a rating of 8, that would be $2.25. If somebody spends $17 on a meal and gets a rating of 8, that would be about $2.12. If somebody spends $16 on a meal and gets a rating of 7, that would be about $2.28. The incentive is to have them not spend their full budget and to try to improve service. It does mean you may put a little bit more money in than is currently spent, for instance, on food, but you're having them use the additional money to improve quality and not for any other purposes. The contractors have to decide how much money to spend on food and service in order to maximize their return. If they spend more money in improving quality, they may get a higher rating. They still have to try to save money, and they still have to try to produce a high-quality meal. And it gives the service personnel a chance to make a choice over their own lives in denying contracts to people who they think are not giving them good food. With military MREs, meals ready to eat, prepackaged food, what can be done is you could have perhaps 3 manufacturers. You would have 3 manufacturing plants which would be next to each other. The personnel would move from one factory to the other, but they would all make MREs. You would then have a competition between the 3 of them. Again, you would give them a maximum amount of money they can spend for each MRE. It is up to them to decide how to make the quality of the food. Whoever has the highest rating would get the biggest part of the contract. So if you have 100%, somebody might get 50%, somebody might have 30%, and the third plant would only get 20%. The lowest management would then be removed. You would pick perhaps 3 divisions in the U.S. military who would be the test divisions for each product line. One division would get it from the first manufacturer, another division would get it from the second manufacturer, and then a third division would get it from the third manufacturer. And over the course of a year, they would test the quality of the product. The other divisions in the U.S. military would get the inventory of MREs that exist, just handed out on a random basis. Another version of it is competitive service districts. The best way of running healthcare is to set up a system of competitive service districts. You would take the country, you would divide it up into blocks of people. Let's say 1.5 million. There's about 300 some million people, so you have about 200 districts in the United States. They will be given an amount of money for each person for healthcare. Their goal is to provide the best healthcare and save money. Again, there is an incentive for them not to spend their full budget. Whoever has the most expensive care is going to be dropped. But at the same time, they must improve quality. If somebody spends $6,000 per person for healthcare and they get a rating of a 7, that's $857. You divide the 6,000 by the 7, you get $857 roughly. If somebody else spends $5,000 and they get a rating of 6, that's $833. They have to try to provide good enough service and hopefully better service at the same time saving money. It's a flexible system in that if someone doesn't want to be directly part of it, if there are groups who want to run, for instance, a luxury hospital, they can still do it, but they have to have some kind of service contract. The person in charge or the organization in charge of each competitive service district would be the contracting authority. And so to open a hospital, you would have to give something back, either money or provide some services at a discount. That allows flexibility. That allows people to have different choices of more expensive healthcare if they wish to pay for it, but the providers of that healthcare then have to again give something back in some way or another, making healthcare less expensive for everyone else. In addition to the clients of the hospital, the other people involved in the hospital could also rate the hospital system and the quality of care. That would be the nurses, the orderlies, the doctors, and administrative personnel. And that would require the people running the competitive district for the hospitals to actually meet their needs and improve service all the way around. Additional objective measures could also be used. So, for instance, the rate of infections of people in a hospital could be multiplied in one manner or another times the cost to make it more expensive. So that encourages them to have good outcomes in areas that are being emphasized. Fees charged by the healthcare providers would be part of the rating. So if they charge nominal fees of $5 or $10 per visit or more, in order to discourage people from being wasteful in the use of the services, people think it is too much money, would essentially be a co-payment. They can again downrate the healthcare provider, and the healthcare provider risks losing their contract. Again, forcing them to be responsive to what people want and what people think is good quality care. In healthcare, having too many facilities performing the same procedures can actually increase the death rate because each facility performs too few operations. This has been documented in such procedures as heart transplants. By holding them accountable for cost and efficiency, there is a discouragement in having excessive facilities, both within one competitive district and even across competitive districts. Each competitive district would have to save money and, again, can be held accountable for outcomes, so that they would then have to cooperate and consolidate facilities in order to achieve these goals. This is better for everyone in the long run. And again, the districts can be held accountable by making each district rate the surrounding districts. That forces cooperation in the event of a major health crisis or a major accident, such as an aircraft accident. Again, you're removing what is known in economics as a perverse incentive. And the perverse incentive is to spend your entire budget. That's foolish. You want to encourage people to try to provide a high quality service and still save some money. This can be used for almost any service that doesn't have a direct flavor to it. A generic service, such as sanitation, police work, road maintenance, or parks. You'd give them the money and have the people who are locally affected by it rate the quality of the service, and then the least performing individuals would be removed. At the upper end, some of them would be given the least performing services. You want to have some rate of introduction of new management. So if 20 districts are, for instance, lost because they were inefficient, you might want to give it to somewhere between 10 and 15 of the best rated districts. The remainders you'd want to bring in new management teams and see if new management might be able to improve it. This makes government more efficient and more flexible, and it gives people some choice over their own lives. This can also be used for things like cable television service, where each cable television company would again be rated by its customers. The lowest rated cable television providers would then be put on the auction block to a qualified bidder. The qualified bidders would be, among others, the best rated cable television providers. This provides an incentive for cable television providers to reduce rates for customers and gives customers some choice over who their provider is, or at least giving them the satisfaction of firing a provider whom they can't stand. The way cell phones have done is also stupid. They have 2 providers in each district. Well, that means you have to spend twice as much capital on all the infrastructure they need, and you don't get better service. If you had made it competitive, there would be 1 provider for each district, but they would get fired if people are unhappy with the service. When you have situations as it currently exists, there is a strong incentive for both companies to provide equally bad service because they have a built-in profit margin. If they're going to be fired for bad service, they're going to work to reduce costs and they're going to work to improve service. That would be much more efficient and give people a much higher quality of service. That would also be an improvement. With something like cable television, the costs would be part of the rating. So if people think that it's too expensive, they can then fire the entire cable television company. It is where taxes are being distributed for cost that it is a good idea to have the money divided by the rating to encourage people not to spend their full budget and to return excess funds to try to be efficient. But with something like cable television or with cell phones, it is actually the cost is part of the rating. If people think it is too expensive, they can vote out that provider. Over time, providers will endeavor to reduce costs and provide better services to avoid losing their business. It is a much more effective way of providing services and a much more efficient system of regulation. The one problem with things, of course, like cable television is there's a large capital expenditure. And so they would have to have the capital cost would have to be recovered by some means. That makes it more complicated. But it still can probably be done as long as you have a functioning legal system, which the United States actually really doesn't. This can also be used to deal with the issues of net neutrality. If people are unhappy with how their internet provider is queuing or providing the offerings of various providers, they can again vote out their provider. Again, people can then regulate the kind of service they want themselves. Airline traffic is completely mismanaged. What people care about is getting from one city to another. They don't care about which airline they fly on. It would be better if you put the unit of competition on the airport authorities. So the airport authorities would schedule and arrange aircraft to fly from city to city. This would enable, for instance, from New York to Los Angeles to have fewer planes that are physically larger making the flights. You would still have a good choice of times when aircraft leave, but instead of having 3 or 4 different airlines flying them, because the airport authority is deciding it, the aircraft will be larger. That means fewer movements out of New York airports, fewer movements into Los Angeles airport. That should be able to reduce delays in traffic and enable smoother functioning. The passengers would rate the airport authority. The airport authority would hire the planes, what's known as a wet lease. There's 2 ways you can lease an airliner. A dry lease means you get the physical body of the airplane, then you have to perform maintenance and operate the aircraft. A wet lease is the entire airplane with the aircrew and the maintenance. So what are currently the airlines would still be providing the function of operating the aircraft. The airport authorities would then decide which aircraft to fly and how big of an aircraft. Passengers would rate the airport authority on the total quality of the flight. For instance, things like legroom. So the airport authority would have to decide whether to increase legroom a little bit and also increase ticket prices. In order to force cooperation between them, the different airports would also rate each other. So the Los Angeles airport would rate New York, Chicago, St. Louis, and the other cities. The rating would be based upon how much traffic goes between the 2 cities. So if 10% of the traffic goes from New York to LA, the LA airport would then account for 10% of the vote for the quality of traffic in New York City. That forces cooperation. They have to provide good service to passengers, they have to schedule it, they have to make the airport function smoothly, and they have to cooperate with the other airport. If any airport tries to dump traffic on their airport, the other airports can lower a rating on them and they will be forced out. This is a better way of operating airlines. For police departments like New York City, the senior management doesn't seem to do anything. There's a basic truism of all management is that above the project level, the next level of management, all it does is interfere. This appears to be what happens with the New York City Police Department. Project level is the individual precincts. It's hard to know what the next level of management does in the New York City Police Department. It seems to do nothing, actually. Instead, you have the precincts voting each other. Again, it forces cooperation. What has constantly happened in policing is a lack of cooperation. So what would happen is the different precincts would be voted on by their neighboring precincts. That forces them to cooperate. If they don't cooperate, precinct commander will be driven out. This can also be extended across city boundaries, county boundaries, and even state lines, where you have two abutting police departments who often historically refuse to talk to each other. By forcing them to be voted on by their neighboring departments, it forces cooperation, and you get better quality policing and more efficient service. In federal law enforcement, it's another total mess. You have the Department of Homeland Security, which is idiocy, and the FBI, who doesn't talk to anyone, apparently. You'd be better off taking the various federal law enforcement agencies and setting them up by their area of operation. For instance, in New York City. So in New York City, you would have the Coast Guard, which has some law enforcement authorities. You would have the immigration. You would have people who deal with customs. You would have the various groups the FBI traditionally deals with, such as bank robbery, kidnapping, major crimes. Each of these groups would then raid each other. So in the New York area, they would have to cooperate with each other. It would be a good idea to also include the prosecutor's office. Everyone has to cooperate or the other groups are going to kick them out. In addition to that, the various groups, for instance the counterfeiting group, would then rate the neighboring departments responsible for counterfeiting. The FBI would essentially be broken down into different component groups with different functions and different responsibilities. The big monolithic FBI doesn't really seem to do a lot of good. By forcing groups to cooperate within each area of operation, you'll get more efficient local policing. In addition, by forcing them to cooperate with their neighboring groups. So the counterfeiting group in New York City would have to be cooperating with such groups as New Jersey and Connecticut. Each group would have to cooperate with each other. Get rid of the vertical management, which doesn't do anything. By having additional layers of management, nothing is accomplished. What does need to be done is auditors need to be brought in. The lowest rated managers need to be removed, but the next group of managers up need to be audited. In addition, there should be some random audits of all departments. You need to have people who go down and talk to people from the top to the bottom of each organization. The lowest ranking people, the middle ranking people, and the senior people, and ask them, are there problems? Are they getting cooperation? Or are the groups working with them? And if you find a defect, someone has to go in and make a change. That would mean you need to have someone who has the overall authority to remove all federal law enforcement. There are various ways you could do this. You could have group voting. You could have a certain number of auditors. And if someone thinks that there is a serious defect, a group of auditors, maybe 5, would be appointed. 3 vote to remove a supervisor. The supervisor would be removed. This forces cooperation, increases competence, finds defects, and corrects. The current system does none of that, which is why it is a dysfunctional mess. Comparative competition can actually produce much higher levels of competition and produce much faster responses than selective competition. When the service is a service that doesn't essentially have a flavor to it, when there is no individual sense of good or bad, just an abstract sense of quality, such as whether you can make a telephone call, whether the phone call is actually completed, as opposed to whether or not you like a given cut of suits or you like the particular food served at a restaurant. By the way, if a dictatorship wanted to have a state-controlled economy, this would be the best way to do it. Competitive districts can also be used for banking services and can make banking more efficient. Again, the country would be divided into perhaps blocks of 1 million to 1.5 million people, and one bank would provide all the banking services for that district. The people who receive the banking services would then rate the banking service. The lowest rated districts would then have to sell off their banking. This means that the concept of too big to fail really doesn't exist, because there'll be a constant shifting and selling off of entire banking structures. One of the problems with banking is, quite simply, there are too many banks. It is inefficient and it is stupid to have 10 banks within 2 blocks. It doesn't benefit anyone. Banking services don't have a texture or a flavor to them. It's just transferring money. By having one group responsible for it, you get the same quality of banking, but the customers can reject the entire banking service if necessary. It forces the banks to provide good service. It also forces them to try to reduce their various fees and costs. And at the same time, in the event that a bank does something stupid, you can just sell off its individual districts, those 1 million to 1.5 million blocks of people. Those areas of 1 million to 1.5 million people can each individually just be sold off, transferred to other banks. So the concept of too big to fail also doesn't exist. It is a more efficient and more effective way of running banking.